So, do you remember back in the day when your mother would spank you and you thought that was the worst punishment ever? Well, that's nothing compared to what you're about to hear. Children of ancient times were not treated with kid gloves. Even their playtime wasn't necessarily a fun time, as each game or sport mirrored life's crazy journey like in ancient Rome. The harsh birthing conditions in 1st century Rome meant that children learned to fight for their lives right from birth. Mothers in labor often resorted to superstition and religion to save their lives because of little scientific knowledge at the time. When the babies were finally born, the parents would refrain from naming them until after a few days, for fear that the newborns might pass away. Once the child crossed the required number of days, a ceremony was held to rejoice and commemorate the feat. You might think that harsh birthing conditions of the day would make the parents more loving and gentle towards their children. Wrong. The child's troubles have only just begun. And it was even worse if they were born into a poor family. Poor families could barely feed themselves due to the rough economy, so it was common for Roman children to contribute to the family's income. Thus, a boy took on his father's occupation to support the family. If his family were farmers, then he would have to help out on the farm. Loafing was severely discouraged, and boys caught idling during work hours were made as scapegoats to show the example of what happens when you slack on your chores. I never had chores, as I was a perfect child. Okay, that's not entirely true, but I did allow my parents to raise me rent-free. Interestingly, parents never considered this as exploitation or even detrimental to their children's development. And before you go judging them through your tainted modern lenses, consider the fact that they could barely afford a decent 3-square meal, let alone hire a farmhand to help. On the other hand, wealthy families treated their children relatively well. They were allowed to swim, play with their wooden toys, and ride the seesaws. But even those kids weren't spared the jarring realities of the times. Rome was expanding, which meant it was constantly at war, and thus needed a constant supply of troops. Therefore, these kids often engaged in mock battles, using wooden swords and chariots in preparation for adulthood when they were drafted into the Roman army. However, the silver lining of this dark and dreary childhood was education. Fathers taught their sons reading, writing, arithmetic, and moral values, while mothers educated their daughters on how to manage a household, emphasizing traditional Roman virtues. Schooling was compulsory for all boys. Low-income families attended public schools known as ludus literarius, much like we have today, while wealthy families preferred homeschooling their kids. This naturally leads me to the question: which would you prefer, homeschooling or the public school system? Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. Childhood in ancient Egypt was somewhat temperate. Of course, the kids often helped out with domestic chores and supplemented the family's income, but they also had the opportunity to play. The Egyptians loved games and would often leave some in the burial chambers for the mummies so they wouldn't get bored in the afterlife. Ancient Egyptian boys played with toys, dolls, and balls made from plant fiber or rags tied with string. But they did love their board games. Two extremely popular games were Mehem and Senet. Mehem was a pretty simple and straightforward game, where each player moved their pieces on a board to the snake's head before their opponent's lion ate them up. The player with the most pieces at the end of the game was the winner. Senet, on the other hand, was a strategy-focused game in which two players moved 10 or more pawns across a 30-square board. The exact rules of the ancient game are unknown, but you can find various modern versions of the game with their unique rules and goals. Which of these games sounds more interesting to you? Vote Mehem by liking this video and Senet by subscribing to this channel. If the kids were not helping out at work or playing, they were likely in training camps, being prepared to become soldiers. They were put through grueling exercises like wrestling, running, sparring, and the use of weapons. Children that were slow or had testy attitudes were often punished with exercises geared to sharpen their skills, which they would need on the battlefield. Egyptian boys trained for war, but ancient Greek boys trained for the Olympics. Ancient Greece is famous for inventing the Olympics, which was as big a deal back then as it is today. Olympians received some of the highest national honors on offer, were extremely famous, and were often wealthy. Thus, parents often kept an eye out for their boys who had a knack for athletics. Once a budding talent is spotted, they are shipped off to training camps to begin the road to Olympia. The training for these boys, which often began around age 7, covered all the disciplines in the Olympic Games, including wrestling, racing, hockey, football, and pancration. But childhood wasn't all about the Olympics. Education was a priority. So parents would enroll their boys in public schools to learn maths, reading, writing, poetry, and music. Girls hardly had the privilege of formal education. Therefore, they weren't enrolled in schools. Instead, they were trained in domestic chores in preparation for marriage, and, on the odd occasion, taught how to read and write. If they had time to spare, the kids were often found playing hopscotch, knucklebones, and marbles. The ancient Greeks were sporty, but the Vikings were savage, and so was their childhood. Due to their all-conquering, unforgiving nature, their children's training was mainly functional to prepare them for war. Morning exercises for boys including challenging movements such as burpees, squats, walking planks, and bunny hops. These exercises didn't require expensive equipment and could be practiced anywhere. In the afternoon, you'd find them running, jumping, or wrestling to condition their minds and bodies. Evening exercises included skating, skiing, snowshoeing, rowing, and riding horseback. And once a boy could handle a weapon, he was taught to thrust a sword, swing a battle axe, and throw a spear. Viking boys also trained in shipbuilding to help them maintain their ships in the event of a war. When the kids were training for battle, they learned to either sew, weave, spin wool, farm, or hunt. The boys especially worked hard on their farms and produced wood and metal goods that they diligently maintained. Idleness was a luxury for Viking boys and for Chinese children. However, unlike the Vikings, ancient Chinese parents emphasized knowledge and education over war. They expected their kids to outperform their colleagues in academics, sports, and music, and would go to all lengths to achieve that enviable feat. The kids themselves felt the pressure to live up to their parents' expectations, which sometimes negatively affected them. Sadly, kids who trailed academically often felt like losers because of the constant, unhealthy comparison to brighter kids. On the other hand, brilliant kids were hailed, received more attention, and were made the standard of excellence for other children. When the kids were not busy competing to outdo each other in school, they engaged in archery, rowing, and board games for exercise and fun. Other games include shuttlecock, yo-yo dokong, also called Diablo, kites, and ping pong, popularly referred to as table tennis. These prepared the body for acrobatic display. Even in this, they still found a way of competing against each other, striving for supremacy and to be crowned as the best at that sport. It was as if the life of an ancient Chinese boy was less fun and more competition. However, life for a young Aztec boy was war. They were often perceived as prospective warriors and conditioned to become such. Once they were off, the boys were admitted to schools called Tilpakoli, where they were trained in tough military exercises and warfare. The schools observed strict rules and etiquette and didn't treat disagreeable youth with kid gloves. Punishment for boys who went against the rules ranged from being pierced with a cactus plant to being dangled headfirst over a flaming fire sprinkled with hot spices. As a polytheistic society, the Aztec youth were trained to impersonate various deities in addition to their military, domestic, and civic training. It was considered an honor for a young man to dress up like a god and walk among his fellow men with pomp and pride. In some bizarre religious ritual, a young man was allowed to impersonate a deity and live like one for a year. During that year, he was fed all the delicacies and indulged in all the luxury society had to offer. At the end of the year, an elaborate ceremony was held, during which the young man was sacrificed to the god he impersonated. Yikes. That doesn't sound like any fun at all. The idea was to create a cosmic balance and appease the deities, lest they release their fiery wrath on society. Childhood in ancient times was fun, hard work, and dangerous, depending on the society. But you can't fault them. The prevailing circumstances of the time dictated the upbringing of the children. Boys who lived in societies prone to constant raids were taught the art of war right from infancy, while kids who grew up in stable civilizations took to academics and sports. In all, each of them had memorable boyhoods that they took to their graves. However, did you know that history is replete with a few idiots who went to their early graves because of their stupidity? Click on this video and I'll tell you all about them. And as always, thanks ever so much for watching.